Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewińśki. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia has a population problem, not a Western values problem, not a TikTok ruined the youth problem, a basic mathematical problem. More people are dying than being born, and the gap is getting wider every year. And instead of asking why Russians don't want children, the Kremlin has decided the solution is pressure, surveillance, and guilt. Of course, nothing secures the future like a government that tracks pregnancies while sending fathers to the front line. So that is why today we're looking into Russia's demographic issues and what has Moscow done to remedy them. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia faces looming consequences from a threat it overlooked for far too long: declining birth rates. Despite state efforts to promote fertility, experts say that the demographic crisis in Russia is rapidly deepening. According to data from Russian authorities, the nation's birth rate stands at approximately 1.4 births per woman. This is well below the level required for population replacement, and because of that, each new generation of Russians will be smaller than the last. Analysts warn that Russia's economy will bear the brunt of this demographic collapse with sluggish growth and fewer workers, as well as high state spending on pensions and healthcare for its aging population. Fertility in Russia, however, varies from region to region, with data from the country's ethnic republics showing significantly higher birth rates. The Southern Republic of Chechnya has the highest fertility nationwide, at 2.7 births per woman, well above the population replacement minimum. Russian authorities have launched multiple state assistance programs in an attempt to raise birth rates, including large one-time payments for mothers of newborn children. These payments can reach 912,162 rubles, approximately $11,500 US. Additionally, new mothers are qualified to apply for housing support and tax relief programs. Despite this, experts have labeled the policies as largely ineffective, as Russian birth rates continue to decline. Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has only worsened the situation, with analysts warning that the combined negative effects of Western sanctions on Russia and the outflow of fighting-aged men to the front line will only deepen the demographic crisis.
And now let's zone in on the east-splaining portion of our show. In the face of its demographic collapse, the Kremlin is pushing the population to combine traditional and religious values with higher fertility. But Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has exposed how tradition and religion can be repurposed to legitimize violence. In today's Russia, religious narratives have been tightly fused with state ideology, transforming the war against Ukraine into what some have called a sacred struggle.
At the center of this process is the Russian Orthodox Church, which has aligned itself closely with the Kremlin. This relationship reflects a long historical pattern in which the Russian state exerts control over religious institutions, from the Tsarist era through the Soviet period. Since the 1990s, the Church has helped cultivate concepts that blend theology, nationalism, and imperial ambition. These concepts now serve as a moral justification for territorial expansion and war. While presenting itself abroad as a defender of traditional values, the Church has supported rhetoric that portrays the conflict as a holy mission. Russian Orthodox Bishop Patriarch Kirill has used language evoking sacrifice and redemption that critics say sanctifies killing and suppresses dissent. In Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories, this ideology has coincided with widespread religious repression, including the banning of non-Moscow-aligned churches and the persecution of clergy. Ukrainian religious communities have pushed back against this distortion of Christian teaching. For many theologians, the war highlights an urgent challenge: confronting the misuse of faith as a geopolitical weapon and reaffirming religion's role as a force for peace rather than destruction.
And now it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. For more than 30 years, Russia has been quietly disappearing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, and now irreversibly, it seems. Since the early 1990s, Russia has lived with negative natural population growth, interrupted only briefly between 2013 and 2015. Births stopped keeping up with deaths a long time ago. And since 2020, even migration, traditionally the Kremlin's demographic safety valve, has failed to compensate for the loss. Russia is shrinking because fewer children are being born, more people are dying, and the state has run out of ways to pretend this is a temporary problem. The long-term causes are well known: low fertility, aging society, regional inequality, poor healthcare outcomes. but the short-term shocks have been devastating. COVID-19 hit Russia harder than the Kremlin ever admitted, producing one of the highest excess mortality rates in the world. And then came the war against Ukraine, a demographic event whose true cost remains classified, but whose effects are already visible. Since the invasion, an estimated 250,000 Russian men have been killed. Hundreds of thousands more fled abroad to avoid mobilization. Officially, Moscow says demographics are a top priority. In practice, they are a secondary concern, constantly sacrificed to the war effort. This contradiction defines Russia's current population policy. The state is running one of the most aggressive natalist campaigns in the world. We've seen expanded maternity benefits, restrictions on abortion, and open stigmatization of childlessness. The Ministry of Education is exploring ways to create conditions for romantic relations in schools, and now even a federal register to monitor pregnant women is actually being in the course of talks, if you believe that. Now, the message is clear. Women are expected to fix a structural crisis caused by decades of state failure. Kremlin pressure has increased, births have not, however, because none of this addresses the central, fundamental issue. Russia is asking people to build families in a society defined by fear, instability and war. And for many Russians, especially for the women, that is not a rational choice. As demographers point out, the pool of potential parents is already shrinking. Proposals like switching off social media at night to encourage sex aren't signs of confidence. They reflect a leadership that understands the scale of the problem but refuses to confront its cause. And that cause is the war. Kremlin polling suggests that nearly 40% of Russian women of childbearing age don't plan to have children in the next 5 years, because they see what the state is doing and what it demands in return. Putin hasn't created a society that encourages life. He's created one that people don't want to bring children into. Russia's demographic decline wasn't caused by the invasion of Ukraine, but the war has accelerated it, hardened it, and locked it in place. The tragedy for the Kremlin is that this is the one crisis that propaganda cannot reverse and repression cannot outbreed. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So first, an open question. Would you say it is fair to assess that Russia is trying to weaponize pretty much all aspects of its society, but with varying degrees of success?
That's certainly true. There are so many constraints that Russia is operating under now, as particularly demographic, that it has to try to pull out as much as it can from the existing population, try to boost the numbers, which it isn't having any success at doing, and also bringing in more immigrants, something that is extremely unpopular among Russians.
So demographics has been a problem for Russia before, but now it is even more acute given that the regime really wants to boost fertility rates. It wants to present this image of a conservative society really doing its thing for the maintenance of we will use the word bloodline. It does imply parts of this ideology being more 19th century than 21st century, but this is really what's happening there, right? Russia is approaching this from a nationalist angle to a large extent, right?
Well, that's what the Kremlin would like to do. In fact, in the major cities of the Russian Federation, and now 75% of Russians live in cities, the fertility rate, the number of children per woman per lifetime, has dropped to about 1 or 1.1, which is less than half of the 2.2 plus needed to maintain the population. In rural areas, it's still above that, but it's still now below the 2.2 figure, except in non-Russian areas. The only place where the Kremlin can see a growth in its population is in non-Russian areas, which is exactly the reverse of what Mr. Putin wants, who would like Russia to become more Russian rather than the other way around. Indeed, a recent projection by demographers in Moscow suggests that in 50 years, a majority of the population of the Russian Federation will be Muslims, from members of Muslim nationalities. That suggests that Moscow and the Kremlin have very little chance of reversing both the demographic changes that are common of all industrial societies and also the particular problems that flow from Russia's historical experience.
Would you say that the Kremlin is worried about that because it still maintains a very outdated view of what society is supposed to be? That it pretty much rejects the notion of adaptation, of the cross-pollination, different cultures, evolution. But once a society frozen in time, it wants to go back to what Russia had been, perhaps back towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, before the modern processes actually began reshaping this society.
Well, it wants to go back in some ways, but not in others. Clearly, it would like to see a fertility rate in the 5 to 7 children per woman per lifetime. That almost certainly isn't going to happen. No country that's tried to promote that kind of return to the past has succeeded. And I think that cooler heads in the Kremlin know it isn't going to happen there. But if you're going to have a population or fertility rate as low as Russia's, then you have to look to other ways of addressing your problems. And that the Kremlin isn't willing to do or can't do, given the kind of money it's spending on its war in Ukraine. One of the reasons that birth rates are so low in the Russian Federation is that housing is so scarce in the big cities. And it's very difficult to ask people to have 5 or 6 children if they live in an apartment with 1 bedroom. To change that would require a fundamental change in the Russian economy and Russian state policy so that people would have the kind of housing that might open the door to birth rates going up. But until that's done, there's no chance. And indeed, in the last few weeks, we've seen the Russian government scrap its program for rebuilding housing, for improving housing, making sure that everyone has indoor plumbing, has heat, has water, indoor water, so that there are many, many people who are really suffering, and to expect those people to bring more children into the world the way Putin would like is a nonsense. What Mr. Putin is saying and what can happen on the ground are two fundamentally different things. Unfortunately, what Putin says gets a lot of attention, especially in the West, whereas what is actually going on in the ground tends to get much less. So the depth of the problem that the Russian Federation faces demographically is not adequately appreciated.
So if Vladimir Putin is unable to present people with prospects of prosperity, partially because he's spending so much on the war, which is inconsistent with that aim, what other ways, what other incentives are being presented and what results are being achieved right now? Because these incentives are of various different kinds, right? From financial ones to even criminalizing certain behavior, right?
Well, you see the Russian government trying to offer women maternal capital, additional. If you have more children, you get more money. What has happened is that's changed the timing that people will choose to have children, not the total number. One recent program that the Kremlin set up about a year ago was to encourage school-age girls to have children, and they would get money. What that has done has not so much boosted the birth rate as increased the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, of other kinds of social problems. These young women often don't then get married. The children are often then warehoused in orphanages, creating yet another problem. And so that program is collapsing. The numbers of people who are willing to do that is relatively small, and I don't think money by itself, just handing money to people, will get them to have more children. What they have to have is a feeling that they will have much bigger housing, much better housing, they will have much better prospects for jobs, and they will live in a country that isn't at war with the world, so that it won't all be taken away in some future military conflict. We're now less than a week away from Putin's expanded war in Ukraine, lasting more days than World War II did for the Soviet Union. And that suggests to people that we even if the war in Ukraine stops, if it ends in some way, that Putin will engage in other kinds of conflicts because he has very little other way to mobilize the population. But mobilizing the population is at odds with increasing the birth rate. And that's something that Putin isn't willing to address. Somehow he assumes that there will be another Russian miracle. There won't be. And Russia will continue to decline at an accelerating rate, probably exceeding 1 million people a year decline over the next 30 to 50 years, as well as I've already said, changing the ethnic composition of that country away from the historically ethnic Russian majority to a non-Russian majority, and it mostly Muslims.
So a regime that thrives on forever wars cannot solve issues in ways that would have been commonly accepted in other countries. So it is trying to resort to other means. And one of them has been ideology. How has this been working? Because the Kremlin has been promoting the idea that, we are an orthodox, conservative society, supporters of traditional values, and the antithesis of the so-called decadent West, right to the point that certain behaviors like promoting the so-called culture of childlessness or child-free culture, this is supposed to actually attract certain penalties. What results do you think are going to be achieved with that? This and also the weaponization of the Orthodox Church, which has been going on for quite a while.
Banning child-free organizations doesn't get people to have more children. That hasn't worked in any society, and it isn't working here. That's blaming the messenger, if you will. The idea that that Russians are committed Orthodox and want an Orthodox society of the year 1890 isn't working either. A lot of people who are quite prepared to be Orthodox aren't prepared to believe that they should have large families and live in a one-bedroom apartment. But I think the clearest indication of what's happening is this. A number of Russian regions, an increasing number to be sure, have effectively banned abortions, that abortions can't be gotten in government clinics anymore and in many private clinics. That was supposed to lead to a rise in the birth rate. It hasn't. Instead, what it's done is contribute to two other things. First, more and more Russian women who want abortions, not so that they don't have more children, are turning to illegal abortions, which are much more dangerous, and many women are unfortunately injured or die as a result. Or, and this is something that I think is going to become increasingly important, they're engaging in what Russians have come to call abortion tourism. That is to say, if you live in a federal subject, Oblast Krai republic that has effectively banned abortions, but two federal subjects over in another Oblast Krai, a republic, they're still legal. What you do if you want an abortion is you go to the other republic and you get it. There's been no evidence showing that that restrictions on abortions have led to a rise in the number of children in the Russian Federation. It hasn't worked elsewhere, and it's not working in the Russian Federation, and I don't think it will. The propaganda, the idea that we are an Orthodox society, people are interested in that. That does gain traction, but that doesn't mean that they're willing to have more children when they don't have space for them, they don't have jobs that pay enough, and they see a future where ever more things will be taken away from them to promote a foreign policy which is aggressive in the extreme. So until that changes, I don't think you have any hope of seeing Russia reverse its demographic decline.
Paul Goldbaum was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us, and as always for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukraine's military is advertising far more jobs than a year ago, but fewer people are applying, highlighting how the country's deepening labor and demographic crisis is now directly constraining its war effort.
New figures indicate that the armed forces of Ukraine nearly tripled the number of advertised vacancies in November 2025, compared with a year earlier, even as applications declined. Several regions recorded up to 78% decreases in applications to join Ukraine's military. Although headline military salaries remain well above the national average, they are heavily driven by frontline combat bonuses that disappear once personnel rotate to rear positions, leaving base pay comparable to civilian sector jobs. The trend mirrors wider pressures on Ukraine's economy, where millions have left the country since 2022 and employers across sectors report acute labor shortages. Roles most in demand, such as unmanned aerial vehicle operators, drivers, and medics, require technical skills that higher pay alone may not secure, despite planned salary increases announced by Volodymyr Zelensky.
Russia's government has been ordered to sharply increase tax collection in 2026 as slowing growth, rising deficits and stubborn inflation put growing strain on the country's finances.
Vladimir Putin has instructed the government to deliver a significant increase in tax revenue in 2026, according to directives published by the Kremlin. The plan calls for bringing more economic activity into the formal tax system while simultaneously reviving growth, which has slowed close to zero. Data from the Ministry of Economic Development of Russia shows GDP growth of just 0.1% year-on-year in November, with industrial output already in recession. Putin tasked Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin and Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina with delivering results, including curbing inflation to 4 to 5%. Measures include a value-added tax hike to 22%, tighter taxation of small businesses, and new levies on electronics aimed at narrowing a ballooning budget deficit.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.